Live from Gerber, this is the Locked Tomb podcast. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
We're rereading Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. Today we're talking about chapters 19 through 25. Things are pretty tense and shitty in the Mithraeum, which is not aided by the fact that the Saint of Duty keeps on trying to kill Harrow. We also take a quick detour to Bubble Land, where the Sleeper has killed the Sixth House, who apparently we've never met before. It's very weird. And then finally, it's the moment we've all been waiting for. Harrow makes soup.
Epic soup throwdown. Before we get into it, Amy, someone was telling me that on the 8th house, all of the structures just keep falling over. Why do you think that is?
Why?
Because they only have one column.
Okay.
Now that is a niche Locked Tomb joke. If you have not read the books, you will have no idea why that is funny.
Wow. That's really, really good. Okay. Chapter 19. In this chapter, we learn that Ortis has been basically trying to kill Harrow. Sorry, should I say Ortis or Gideon or the Saint of Duty? Things get confusing.
I feel like maybe this is hilarious. Like, this is so funny also that we have to figure that out.
Yes.
I feel like the Saint of Duty would be, now when I say that, all I hear is the Saint of Duty.
I know, me too. I was just going to say that.
I feel like Saint of Duty can be consistent. If we say Ortis, we should say Ortis the First.
Okay.
Or so it really is Gideon the First, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Choose your own adventure.
Okay, so the Saint of Duty is trying to kill Harrow in this chapter. We learn that he's been trying to kill Harrow basically since she got to the Mithraeum. So it's been rough for Harrow. This chapter starts with the time marker of 10 months before the Emperor's murder. It's in second person, and there's a second house skull for the Saint of Duty. So only a couple of days into Harrow's time on the Mithraeum, the Saint of Duty first tries to kill her while she's eating soup in the kitchen. I'm telling you, the soup is everywhere.
Such a soup motif throughout this whole book.
Yeah, we should analyze the soup motif. I was noticing rereading this bit, Gideon is very obvious here. Gideon Nav. Gideon's voice gets stronger and stronger through this book. Mm-hmm. And by this point, I'm noticing a lot of Gideon.
I think that corresponds to also the river bubble world starting to like break apart.
That makes sense.
All of the things that Harrow put in place to keep her from remembering Gideon and like, hiding Gideon's soul from herself, it's all starting to wear away. And it corresponds both to the breaking down of Canaan House, but also just the constant destruction of Harrow's body over and over again by Gideon the First.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And this one bit that I loved, so she's being attacked by the Saint of Duty, and she takes a second in between defending herself to kind of look at him. And the narrator says, "This was a fool's move. Why didn't you run? You chose to watch, like you could learn anything?" A less critical party might have pointed out that you'd had a surprise gift of 12 inches of steel through the chest and made your pecs spring the blade back out with your own rib cage. But you had never been party to excuses. That sounds so much like Gideon.
Yeah, and then we, of course, get another... There are so many... It's so funny. I did not notice the pommel references throughout this book until you said it when we started recording, and now they are everywhere.
I think I counted 3 just in 19 to 25.
Yeah, there's a bunch. But anyway, just Gideon shitting on Harrow once again for not remembering that the butt of the sword is called the pommel.
Yeah, he used the butt of his sword. It would be lying to say that you now regularly called it the pommel to smash the first contract skull to powder. LOL. I had a question about this. There's a moment here where it says that Ortis sucks the thanergy from the bones that she's using. But later on in this section, we learn that she's terrified when she realizes that the Saint of Duty can suck thanergy out of her wards. And so I'm confused about why this is mentioned here, but doesn't seem to have the large implications that it does later.
Well, Amy, a less critical party, might have pointed out that she had 12 inches of steel going through her chest.
That's fair.
You know,
I guess she could have been distracted.
I feel like the function here is this is a little Easter egg for us to notice when we go back and reread. But Harrow's still not putting all the pieces together yet.
That makes sense.
I feel like Harrow at the top of her game should be able to pick up on this from this moment. But as we've seen over and over again so far, Harrow is very much not herself right now. And I feel like she just doesn't grasp it.
Right. Thankfully, Harrow is saved by Mercy Morn, of all people. She's flung out into the hallway and Mercy Morn is there. And Mercy Morn is super annoyed at having to save Harrow. She's very inconvenienced.
She's such an asshole. But she does save Harrow.
Mm-hmm. And she does demonstrate her powers.
Yeah.
By very quickly patching Harrow up. I like the bit where she taps her head and just releases this flood of oxytocin.
I know. I'm like, if I were a lictor, would I just make myself high all the time? They have that power. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I can't lie that I didn't, take this thought quite far. Anyway, Mercy says that Harrow's 12 in this bit, which is just, as we know, throughout this book, she keeps on saying that Harrow is younger and younger until she gets to, I think, 3 years old. I also noticed the description here of Ortis the First's eyes. It says they're a luminous green, a soft, buttery green, less startling or harsh than the green of a shoot or the green of a leaf, but instead liquid and fluvial. Question, though. Are these Gideon the First's original eyes, or are these Pyrrha's eyes? Because there's this weird thing. This is a huge question. It's probably my biggest question that I can't really figure out. And if anyone knows the answer, I would love help. I'm confused because it seems to be that obviously the eyes switch when the lictor process goes correctly. But as we know, Harrow still has her brown eyes. And when Gideon shows up in her body, her eyes turn yellow. And so it would follow that Gideon the First, his original eyes would have been this green. And then when Pyrrha shows up, they would have turned the brown or whatever that they are when Pyrrha is in his body. But first of all, it's implied that these green eyes don't match his face. And secondly, wouldn't people have noticed if his eyes hadn't changed?
I mean, I feel like we talked about this before. It's not particularly consistent. Think about Ianthe and Nibirius's eyes.
Mm-hmm.
She clearly, something's not totally right with her, but she did achieve full lictorhood and her eyes didn't fully turn.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're one of each color or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know.
I know this is actually answered in the Nona excerpt that we got, the first 6 chapters. I don't remember which is which, but I still have this question of why would it be the opposite of what happens to Gideon, Nav, and Harrow.
Right.
Anyway, I guess it's not that important, but I was trying to do these brain gymnastics around it, and I just couldn't figure out what was going on.
Do we know that Harrow doesn't have Gideon's eyes?
Yes, we know.
Okay.
Yeah, because remember, she's like, what did my eyes look like?
Right.
To the
right,
body.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So Ortis doesn't attack Harrow now that she's with Mercy Morn, but he does ask for her longsword, which I didn't really understand.
I mean, I feel like Ortis the First knows that Wake is here in some capacity. So I know that your understanding of why Gideon the First is trying to kill Harrow is because God has asked him to.
Mm-hmm.
But my theory was always he knows that Wake is inside her and he's trying to kill her because of that. I mean, I don't know. It could be both of those things, but I feel like Gideon the First wants Harrow's sword because he knows it's connected to Wake in some way.
Yeah.
And I don't know how he, or Pyrrha, whoever it is who is in there at any given point, really knows that. But clearly he has some sort of sense for Wake's presence.
Right. I think my question is, okay, so remember when we were talking about where is Wake's soul at any given time?
Yeah.
And we thought that maybe, or I thought that maybe when Harrow had stabbed Kitharea's body on that first night that it had transferred. But obviously, according to Gideon the First in this section, he thinks that Wake is still in the sword. So Wake must still also be in the sword. Wake is in like 4 places.
Well, Wake is definitely somehow still in Harrow because of the river bubble. And the sword is, I think when Abigail breaks down revenants and stuff, like there has to be some sort of physical object involved, which would be the sword. And there's Kitharea's body. Maybe it's just different pieces of Wake. Can a soul inhabit 3 different matters? I don't know. Maybe.
I guess the resurrection beasts have their like main body and then heralds.
That's true.
Maybe they can kind of split.
Yeah.
Whatever.
It's a big question though, yeah.
Yeah, if you have thoughts, send them our way. It is a little bit confusing. Wake is in a lot of places. Wake really gets around.
Wake gets around. So after Gideon the First does not get Harrow's sword, Harrow's like, it's mine. And Mercy Morn,
loses patience.
Yeah, loses patience and is like, get out of here. And Gideon the First leaves. Mercy asks Harrow what she did to piss him off. And Harrow's like, nothing. And Mercy says, oh, he just wants to kill you then. I don't get what she is realizing in this moment.
I think that it's just that the Saint of Duty... God, you've ruined the Saint of Duty.
I know.
Unbelievable. So Gideon the First, as we see later at that meal when they're talking about Wake and they're talking about Pyrrha, and he gets really pissed, something tells me that Gideon the First has killed people for insulting him before. Or like, he can definitely be pissed off, and that Mercy was expecting that Harrow had said something to offend him and that he had responded violently. But then when Harrow says that she didn't say anything, Mercy's just like, oh, I guess he just wants you dead then.
Yeah. And then she goes on to say Gideon the First is God's attack dog. So if he thinks you're a threat, you're screwed, essentially, which lends credence to your theory that it's God who asked.
Well, we know God did ask him. That's confirmed later, but it could also be his own reasons as well.
Where is that confirmed?
When Gideon is in Harrow's body, God says right before Mercy Morn kills him, I asked you to fix Harrow to Gideon the First. And Gideon's like,
I see.
Oh, so you're the one who sent Gideon the First after my necromancer.
Right.
God is definitely directing Gideon the First to kill Harrow. I think because he thinks it'll force her to complete the lictoral process.
Right.
It's kind of a shitty way to do it, though.
There's one more little piece in here before we move on to the next chapter that gives us a little bit more of a clue as to what happened 20 years ago between Wake and Gideon. In that when Mercy is like, Ortis, what are you doing? You could just push Harrow out the airlock. It would be much easier to kill her that way. And his reply is, I do things face to face. And she says, oh, well, that's what got you in trouble 20 years ago, which we didn't know then what we know now, which is we're assuming Gideon wanted to kill Wake face to face and then botched that whole situation. And that is what got him in trouble.
Yeah.
Back then.
Also, Mercy Morn doesn't know this, but Gideon the First and Pyrrha, they were hooking up with Wake also.
Yeah.
So it's funny because doing things face to face also started this whole affair.
Right.
And maybe if he'd done stuff from a distance, things would have been different.
Maybe. And so we move on to chapter 20, where we continue this Ortis trying to kill Harrow theme. And we learn that everyone else also just knows this is happening. So various people walk in on Ortis the First trying to kill Harrow. And we learn about AL.
Yeah. So we heard about AL last time when Augustine accused Mercy Morn of trying to be a replacement AL. But now we're getting a little bit more info.
Right.
So first of all, Ortis tries to kill Harrow. At this point, she's counted 14 times. And finally, when she asks God about it, God said, he made a pact with an authority I have no power to gainsay, that he would protect me from all dangers. Now it has been put to him that you are that danger. I don't know who the authority is, and I don't know why. I mean, it's kind of shitty because God put it to him that Harrow is a danger. So
yeah, this is either total bullshit or there are two powers that be that are asking Gideon the First to do this.
mm-hmm.
I mean, God has blatantly lied before.
Right.
So this could also just be, again, a red herring for the reader, or it could just be God being a poop.
A duty.
And further evidence that God is a poo-poo is that right when this chapter opens, it's God who walks in on Ortis trying to kill her and says to Ortis, have pity, she's your responsibility, not a punching bag. Which I guess could be taken to mean, I asked you to try and get Harrow to turn into a lictor through force. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be this violent with her.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's just God playing this role.
Right.
Leading Harrow to believe he has nothing to do with what's going on.
Because Gideon the First says, I find the responsibility a hard one to bear, or something like that.
Yeah.
Also in this conversation that God and Harrow have, God tells Harrow he doesn't think that she misapprehended the lictoral process, and that the only person who had really gotten it wrong was Anastasia. And so we learn a little bit about Anastasia in this bit. So Anastasia was a prospective lictor, one of those first disciples, and we learn a little bit more about her and Samael. Apparently, she said the eightfold word, but something went wrong, and once they'd cleaned up, aka I think what we learn later is that God killed Samael.
Yeah.
And Anastasia wanted God to take her own life, and God instead asked her to bury Alecto. And that's how the Ninth House was started. It's really interesting because I think actually what's interesting about Anastasia is that she was the only one who got it right. She either didn't quite get it right or God meddled and fucked her up.
I'm pretty sure that's what we find out later on, is that Anastasia did figure it out and God was like, oh shit. We can't have another God, and actively sabotaged her in doing this. And the way he tells this to Harrow, feels so icky reading it because he's such a liar. But he twists just enough where there are parts of it that are true, but he's not giving you the full story.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so icky. God is a bad dude.
Yeah, he is. I do think it's interesting that Palamedes almost came up with the same thing that Anastasia did. And I wonder sometimes if the reasons that Harrow did the lobotomy thing is not only because she couldn't bear to lose Gideon, but also because she had an idea that this was possible and wanted to put Gideon aside until she could figure out how to do that.
Totally.
I wonder if somewhere in those letters there's some sort of instruction or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But she didn't have Gideon's body, so she couldn't do it. You know what I mean?
Right.
So.
Yeah, anyway, we can go off on a tangent about where Gideon's body might be right now, but we won't do that. We'll stick to this book, but to be continued. I think that, so as God is telling this story about Anastasia, the body appears, or maybe the body has been there, but we get reference to the body being in this room with God and Harrow. And Harrow asks God, who did you bury? And God says, I buried a monster. And through all of this, again, we get this very sensual description of the body. And I know we've talked before about whether we think God can see the body or not, or if just Harrow can. And there's a question like, is the body really here, or is Harrow hallucinating this? I had a weird theory when I was reading it that maybe this is actually God's memory and somehow Harrow is also seeing it. Because as we get to in a moment, there's a reference to poetry here, which I find funny because poetry plays such a big role in the river bubble, and Harrow fucking hates poetry.
I know. She says, I've never been a fan.
Yeah. So in this universe, she's like, I've never been a fan. But God still, of course, decides to read her a poem, just like he continues to try to make her drink tea and eat biscuits. So he's always forcing these things on her. And he reads an excerpt from an Edgar Allan Poe poem called Annabel Lee. And the excerpt in the book is, "For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee," which is actually towards the end of this longer poem.
Yeah, and if you haven't read this poem, I highly suggest it because the entire poem fits into this universe.
It is fucking wild.
Yeah.
My mind was blown. I hadn't read this poem since I think middle school. And when I read it again, I was like, holy shit, it's almost like Tamsyn Muir lifted the idea of this poem and like placed it into the God Alecto storyline. I mean, it's wild.
Yeah. I wonder if it was a little bit of an inspiration for their whole thing because it's so spot on. Just go read it. It's very good.
There's one stanza in the poem that is notable. Through the poem, the poet is in love with someone named Annabel Lee, but she seemingly might be a class above him. And so when she is of age, there are highborn folks that come in and take her away. And they shut her up in a sepulcher, which is a tomb, in this kingdom by the sea. I mean, this is what happens, right? Which is God's lictors are like, you need to get rid of this monster. And the way that God solves for that is he shuts her up in a tomb.
Yeah. And it says, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee.
God, the soul, I mean, come on.
I mean, like,
you know?
come on.
Like, come on.
Yeah, it's pretty spot on. I also thought it was interesting in this part, God calls Alecto a monster, or he says, I buried a monster. And later in the book, when the lictors are saying that she's a monster, he says, she's not a monster. And then I think Augustine or Mercy says she was a monster in a human suit. So it's interesting here that he calls her a monster.
God is a complex character.
Certainly is. So we take a little bit of a detour from the Mithraeum storyline to go back to the Canaan House bubble. What's interesting in this bit is that we meet the actual Dulcinea Septimus for the first time.
Amy, when you read this, or when you even read this, the way that you pictured Cytherea in the first book, whatever image you built up of what she looked like, when the real Dulcinea came into the picture in this book, did you picture the same person or someone different?
I feel like I pictured the same person with shorter hair.
Wow, shorter hair. That's interesting.
Yeah, shorter hair and different eyes, I think.
Huh.
But yeah, very similar demeanor and, you know, I think we don't get a ton of chance to see Dulcinea Septimus, the real one, actually like really developed. But you can tell that she is different from Cytherea.
Yeah. Yeah, she's definitely seems a lot sweeter.
Honestly, I would say that she seems a little bit fiercer. That like evil fairy moment at the end, we can talk about that. But she's got a lot of like spark in her. And she doesn't seem as jaded, obviously, as Cytherea.
Right, true.
So we've got the third person again, and it is a fractured sixth house skull, which is interesting. But it makes sense because we find out that two very beloved characters have been killed.
Ugh.
In this chapter. Very hard to read, even though we know it's not real.
Yeah. I mean, we think it's not real. On your first read, you're still like, I'm not sure what's happening here. A fun little bit, we get a seemingly unintentional reference to Wake, in that Harrow is hypothesizing that the same thing that killed Judith also killed Camilla and Palamedes. And Ortis says that he agrees, but perhaps a better name than Sleeper would have been the Waker, which is a funny little moment.
Yeah, it's great to go back and read this. Another thing I noticed is that there's this very funny bit where Ortis and Protesilaus, the real Protesilaus,
What's up with that? I want to know, what's the deal?
I think he's just jealous of him.
Because he's like hot and good at poetry or something?
Yes, he's basically stepped out of one of Ortis's poems and is also has Ortis's one cultivated personality trait. So he's just a better Ortis. But when Magnus is trying to split up this argument that Ortis and Protesilaus are having, he says, "Ninth, you're too good a man to roll over and wait for another death."
I did not catch that. Wow.
I don't think I caught that probably the first couple times I read it, but I think probably going forward, they all remember.
Mm-hmm. We also get Dulcinea asking Abigail if this is how it happens. So we get another refrain here. And then she also asks, does it get any better than this? Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
And Abigail does answer that this is not how it happens, but does not give an answer to whether it gets any better than this.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wonder about that. I mean, Abigail also was murdered very early on in Gideon the Ninth, and so doesn't actually know who survived and who didn't.
Right. And I think at the end of this chapter, she starts to theorize that.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, I wonder if, and I think what she's wondering is if the people who are being killed are the ones that actually aren't here in the first place.
Right. Right.
There's an interesting little biblical reference here where when Dulcinea is saying goodbye to Camilla and Palamides' bodies, she says 1 cord was overpowered, 2 cords could defend themselves, but 3 were not broken by the living or the dead. And that's from Ecclesiastes 4:12 in the Bible, which is interesting. I was like, how are these people quoting the Bible?
Abigail does start to wonder something. And as a reader, we don't quite know what it is, but she essentially moves everyone to action.
Right.
And asks everyone to track down all the others and say, bring them in. Let's get them going. She's checking her assumption. If someone is alive in the real world, they would not be able to be found in this river bubble.
Or if they were found, they'd be kind of this weird, because like Judith was around, but she was this sort of...
Judith wasn't. Judith was found dead.
Right, but there's this bit where Abigail says Marta was sure that Judith was wrong from the very beginning, and like a strange parody of herself. So Marta was experiencing Judith, but thought that Judith was kind of this weird fake version of herself.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think that Abigail is starting to get it.
Abigail's a smart cookie.
You know, she's the best. Harrow does find a note that was left in Palamides' pockets. And unsurprisingly, it's another unhinged, all caps, frantic, scribbled note that we know is from Wake.
It says, him I'll kill quick because she asked me to, and because that much he honestly deserves. But you two mummified wizard shits, I will burn and burn and burn and burn until there is no trace of you left in the shadow of my long-lost natal son. So angry. So we know that the him I'll kill quick is referring to Gideon the First. That because she asked me to is referring to Pyrrha. And the 2 mummified wizard shits are our beloved Augustine and Mercy Morn. In Nona, we learn that the term wizard is derogatory for necromancer.
Yeah. And the long-lost natal son thing is because Wake is descended from people who lived in this solar system.
Yep.
But Ortis is looking over her shoulder and just sees a drawing of the letter S, but it's described as that S that you would draw in like middle school. Where it was like the 6 lines and then you connected them with triangles.
Oh my God, my notebooks were covered in that.
Me too.
I don't know, why?
Why? Who knows, but it's very funny. And finally, at the end of this chapter, Ortis tells Harrow that he knows that his father died at her parents' command. And Harrow's like, what? You know that? And Ortis has a really interesting reaction where he's like, of course I do. You're not the only person who can add up 2 and 2 and get to a 4. it shows that Harrow's a little bit delusional with her belief that people don't understand anything that's going on.
Right. And I mean, to be fair, Harrow had a lot going on as a kid, trying to keep that ninth house running, and I don't think she was paying much attention to anyone else around her.
Right.
There's a curious thing that happens at the very end, and I was wondering about what this is. So after this interaction between Harrow and Ortis, a bunch of rain comes through a broken window, and tumbling through are rusted pipette needles, the hard plex type with measurement markings up the side. And then Ortis asks Harrow if she would like to know if he can also see them. What are these pipette needles?
I think that one theory is that there's something to do with the original facility and like the science and shit that was going on down there. But I think the more likely answer is that this is Wake taking over Caden House in this bubble, and in a similar way to her writing showing up in these notes, these things have something to do with Wake. So I think that they have something to do with her inducing, or her basically using the sample or God's sperm to impregnate herself. Yeah, it's basically her memories of the medical equipment that she used on herself when she was in the shuttle pregnant with Gideon. Ooh. I think that that's what it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm gonna go with that. That never even occurred to me. And then a really beautiful transition into chapter 22 where, of course, Harrow is, this chapter, like many, start with Harrow sleeping and then waking up from his sleeping, and the body says, "Wake up now," which is actually literally Wake is up right now, and Harrow needs to wake up to deal with it.
Right. So we know that this happens somewhere between Harrow killing her 13th planet and her 14th planet, and the 14th planet is where we see Camilla. So that's where we are in the timeline. There's a 7th house skull for obvious reasons. And Harrow is dreaming about having dinner with the body, which apparently she does quite often. And it's interesting because I noticed that it said, she sat opposite the monstrous dead of the locked tomb, who wore the shabby black shirt and trousers of some particularly slovenly penitent, which I think is a reference to Gideon.
Oh.
These little things that I noticed are the reason why I think that somehow the body has taken on a lot of characteristics of Gideon. I think it's also Electo, but I think Electo and Gideon are in a similar place. I think actually in this bit, she's kind of seen Gideon. But the body tells Harrow to wake up, and she does.
She does, and then it's a creep fest for the rest of this chapter. It's a pretty short chapter, and essentially she looks out in the hall, and fucking Mithraeum is moving down the hallway in a really creepy, cliche horror movie type way where her body is kind of rigid, and then the body falls over, and she's inching closer to Harrow, and there's a description here that says it was as though a magnet were stuck in the meat, so in Mithraeum's body. A magnet that craves some polar force within you.
Right.
The body of Mithraeum is really trying to get to Harrow, and Harrow's like, oh shit, runs away, slams her door, puts up some ward, I think like stabs her cheek, makes a ward, and then puts a chair beneath the handle. And Mithraeum's body tries to open it once, maybe twice, and then Harrow hears no more.
And the only reason that Mithraeum can't get in is because of the chair.
Then Harrow goes to Ianthe and says Septimus is walking, which again, Harrow is not doing well. Harrow's calling Mithraeum Septimus still. And Ianthe looks really bored by this and is just like, well, tell her I want my arm back, and then shuts the door in Harrow's face. What the fuck is going on with Ianthe here?
I don't know.
Is Ianthe in on... feel like Ianthe knows about Wake and this is part of the gaslighting.
I can't really tell. It's, I've read these books many times, and I still don't know what I think about what Ianthe knows about Mithraeum or not. I don't know. Let's keep an eye out for more clues.
Yeah, Ianthe gets more and more indifferent as these chapters go on at this point in the book, and it's really weird. I don't know. I don't trust that bitch.
Me neither. I don't think anyone should. We get another pommel joke. Just a note. We got a lot in these chapters.
Make a tally.
So it's a kind of a freaky chapter. We don't really know why Kithaerea is trying to get into the room to kill Harrow or to get the sword or to somehow, I don't know. But I'm sure it has something to do with basically taking Harrow's body, which I think is Wake's main goal here.
Yes. And that concludes Act 2.
Yeah. Move on to Act 3. I was just telling someone today that they had to hold on to Act 3. Act 3 gets really good. And then Act 4 is where it gets actually insanely freaking good. So we're almost there.
As a first-time reader, you get all the way through Act 2 and you still don't know what's happening. That is totally normal. You don't have to know that you're reading genius.
Yeah, for sure.
So we are now in chapter 23, which is 4 months before the Emperor's murder. If I had to title this chapter, it would be Saint of Duty plus Kithaerea equals love.
I would title it Rancid Vibes on the Mithraeum.
I mean, that one works too. It gets fucking rough in here. I mean, it's already been rough, but people are salty in this chapter.
Yeah, they are. People are really tense. We're only 4 months away from the resurrection beast showing up. So the tension is rising in the Mithraeum. Also, Ianthe's sword fighting is going really poorly, and Augustine is really fed up with it. It is cute because Harrow does apparently practice fighting with her sword alone, but really can't do anything.
It's really cute. It's like, hey, I'm trying, Gideon. I mean, not that she's thinking that consciously, but, you know.
Yeah, there's a bit where the narrator says you were trying hard in a way that would break the heart of any actual swordswoman, which I think, her heart is sort of breaking.
Yeah. We get some descriptions of the heralds again, and this description actually shaped my mental construct of what these heralds look like. And I think Augustine says, imagine the worst bee, but with a blood aspect. If you knew the whole time it was a multitude of bloods. I'm talking at least 3 different types of blood here. Gross, man, but also like great description.
I know. It's also just it doesn't really make sense because it obviously has something to do with flesh magic, which we don't know that much about. But I just love, imagine the worst bee. And then Mercy says, the last time I fought one, I did it with my eyes closed. When I opened them, they had blood anyway.
Also, quick note about Augustine referencing a bee. There are no animals on the 9 houses because they're thanergetic planets. So I'm kind of wondering, where would Harrow even know what a bee looked like?
I mean, there must be, because we learned that...
There must be?
Nice. I think that there is life, and I don't really understand this. I think it's because the 9 houses are partially flipped, but not fully flipped. Because, for example, when Jolsonid goes to stay with Protesilaus and his wife, he is a farmer.
Right, okay. But the planets have to be fully flipped because they created the resurrection beasts.
Right. But remember when we talked about the first house and how they were fishing?
Oh, yeah.
There's definitely life on these planets still.
Yeah, right. Like, how else would they get food? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously they're growing stuff on the first house.
Right.
The worst bee.
The worst bee. I love bees, so it's hard to even imagine what the worst bee would be, but we can make a bee poem about this.
A bee poem.
So we get another conversation between God and Harrow. So, they have these like regular therapy sessions. I don't know what you would call it. And Harrow's like, is it guaranteed that I'm going to die? And God's like, well, I can only hope that you won't. And also, he says something about Ianthe being far from a perfect sword hand. And then in the same breath, talks about how Ianthe the First is a continual surprise to me. If I was going to pass out a fourth epithet, I'd call her the Saint of Awe, which is really weird on a couple different levels. One, we know that the other saints are named for their cavaliers, and God didn't know Nibirius, and clearly he's naming her the Saint of Awe for her, so like not consistent with the rest of the naming conventions. And two, what the fuck is he in awe of?
I think that God and Ianthe have had a relationship during this time that we never see.
Yeah.
I think that they have some sort of understanding and some sort of I do think that they are in communication about some stuff. And so I assume it has something to do with that.
Right. Yeah.
That he's, kind of amazed by her facility with manipulation and, because she's got some of the strengths that he has as well.
Totally.
So,
Ianthe and God are like two peas in a pod.
Yeah. What a great couple.
That would be creepy, but yeah.
Yeah.
Big age difference there.
Truly. So then there's this very, very weird moment that kind of changes everything.
It does.
And that's when Harrow is going back home from the gym, and she stops by Kithurea's tomb and she sees Gideon the First kissing the dead body of Kithurea.
Bum, bum, bum. This was bizarre to read. The first time, it's bizarre to read every single time.
I know. Very weird. I think Gideon the First just, without even turning around, which I think is because the eyes are not the normal eyes.
Yeah.
You'll notice that every time Pyrrha is in there, she doesn't let Harrow see the eyes.
And so what we're seeing here is Pyrrha surface into Gideon the First body while Gideon's soul kind of sinks back in. And so the assumption here is that it's actually Pyrrha who is kissing Kithurea's body, not Gideon.
Right. And Harrow's first instinct after she leaves is to go and tell Ianthe. Ianthe is enchanted by this information and very happy to hear about it.
Because Ianthe's horny.
And Ianthe loves that Harrow finally has a piece of interesting gossip. And when she learns that Gideon the First was just kissing Kithurea, she gets very disappointed, which is gross.
She's like, whatever. Everyone does that.
Yeah, who hasn't done that? I do find it interesting when Harrow shows up at Ianthe's. Ianthe is taking notes in her journal, and Harrow noted that whatever she was doing involved some quite substantial mathematics.
Yeah.
What is Ianthe doing? What is she up to?
What is Ianthe doing? Ianthe's up to no good. And hey, spoiler alert, by the end of this, we still don't know what no good Ianthe is up to, but she is fucking up to something bad.
We'll know on September 13th.
When we finish that book in one sitting.
I'm taking a day off work, so...
I'm going to make soup while I read it.
Oh my gosh, let's exchange some soup recipes. It's funny because they get on the subject of God, and Harrow tells Ianthe that God said that Ianthe isn't a perfect swordswoman, and Ianthe calls God a dickhead. And Harrow gets really pissed off, and they have this sort of weird standoff where for a moment it seems that they might attack each other.
When I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, this is the fight that leads up to the sex. It's not.
That's later. Yeah, but then, Ianthe's like, ugh, fine, kill me. I have to go practice swords with Augustine in a couple of hours, and I'd rather die.
Yeah, I mean, also, real quick, Ianthe shares with Harrow that she has figured out what Harrow has done to her jaw.
Oh, I know. That passage is really funny, actually.
Yeah.
It's like, you ensorcelled my jaw.
You fucking psycho shadow vestal. And she basically says she's not sure how far back the curse extends, so she doesn't really want to fuck with it.
Yeah.
Potentially, all that complicated mathematics could have something to do with trying to undo this jaw thing.
Could be.
More likely, it's something much more nefarious.
Yeah, definitely. So we move to chapter 24, and we're in the second person still, second house skull. And in this bit, we just learned basically that Ortis can destroy Harrow's wards, and Harrow makes the decision that Ortis must die. We do start with a quick mention of Harrow's birthday. Apparently Harrow's just turned 18. It's kind of sad.
It's really sad. It reminds me of all the sad birthdays that I have had.
Oh.
Birthdays are really hard, y'all. Not all my birthdays have been sad, but in general, birthdays are hard. And this one was relatable to read.
Oh. Well, we'll make this year's birthday great. I'm going to send you a commissioned painting of a naked Ninth House character of your choice.
Okay. Yes, please. I'm going to be holding you to that.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, can someone please let me know if they can do a not safe for work portrait of whoever Mel decides? We could do Gideon.
Can it be both Gideon and Harrow together? I mean, that's
I think
all
that
I want.
exists.
Yeah. But I want one just for me.
Alrighty.
Anyway, continue. 18.
We learn that Harrow has warded her quarters super intensely with mostly bone wards, which makes sense. But it turns out that one night when she's in the bath, which it for her is just like an inch or two of cold water because she thinks that hot water could hurt her. Harrow is attacked by Ortis, who just bursts through her door, doesn't worry about the wards at all, and he attacks her in a really violent way, and she does escape by basically, I think he punches her in the face and her teeth fly out, and in this split second, she turns her teeth into tiny missiles and shoots them into Ortis's eyes.
This is an extremely violent chapter.
I know.
But the creativity, okay. And also, we haven't even gotten to the soup yet. We're getting there.
Mm-hmm.
How many fucking ways did Tamsyn Muir have to dream up how someone could be murdered in like the most roundabout, weird, never been done before way? I mean, this is a brutal brawl. Teeth missiles into the eyes is so badass. Like,
I know.
So epic.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have been there for that brainstorming sesh just to see the process.
Totally.
One of my favorite parts of the book is what happens next.
Whoa.
I don't know why I like it so much, but when Harrow is lying on the floor, she's naked, she's messed up, surrounded by this pool of bloody bathwater. Ianthe walks in, and there's this really interesting moment where Harrow realizes that she's so desperate for comfort that if Ianthe gives her any kindness at this moment, Harrow would lose herself to Ianthe, which is interesting because I feel like I kind of get that. I'll just read this little bit. If Ianthe Tridentarius knelt beside you then, no matter with what sugary contempt or filigreed third condescension, you would press your diminished bloody terror into her. You would creep naked into her lap, shamelessly, and weep. You would crawl like a worm to whatever chilling scrap of solace she would give you. Oof.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is Harrow's breaking point, right? Harrow has been breaking for this whole book, and this is the moment where she has just been totally broken. And the fact that she would crawl into Ianthe's lap is a further testament to how fucking broken she is. I also think that this is Gideon as narrator's way of explaining to Harrow how vulnerable Harrow became and how Ianthe took advantage of her. Because we know a little bit later that when Gideon comes into play, and I'm talking about Gideon the Ninth, comes into play, Gideon like basically yells at Ianthe and is like, you took advantage of Harrow. Mm-hmm. She was vulnerable and you did this. And like, this is one of those moments. To Ianthe's credit, Ianthe just walks away. And I don't know if that's to Ianthe's credit or not, but Ianthe could have gone to Harrow and manipulated her right in this moment, and she doesn't, which I find kind of out of character.
Yeah, well, I mean, Harrow's pretty messed up, and it is interesting because Ianthe walks in and says, oh, this is not how I thought this would happen. which I assume she means like
sexy time.
yeah, and leaves. But I do think it's interesting that Harrow has enough self-awareness to realize that they could have totally owned her.
Ugh.
Harrow decides that the Saint of Duty must die.
And that brings us into chapter 25, otherwise known as Epic Soup Throwdown.
That's right. It starts with Harrow telling God that she saw the Saint of Duty kissing Kithaeria the First, and God dismisses it at first and then is like, well, he's legendarily unamorous, but, that's unfortunate, but doesn't seem that interested in it. I think Harrow, through this whole, this book could be titled, Harrow is gaslit.
Yeah. By everyone.
I know. And Harrow's like, wait, what? Isn't this a sin? And God's like, you need to get some sleep. Why don't you go read a book, make some soup, take a nap? And Harrow's like, okay. And so she learns how to make soup. And she spends several days making soup.
I had a question before we get to soup,
mm-hmm.
which is when Harrow tells God that she saw the Saint of Duty kissing Kithaeria, God goes off and tells her that he only showed interest in Pyrrha and the criminals he hunted.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that Gideon was having an affair with Wake.
Right.
But I didn't think that God knew that. God at least makes it sound like he just found out about that, when it's revealed at the end. So maybe here it makes me believe that actually God did know.
I don't think he knows that he was interested in the criminals he hunted romantically. I think that Gideon the First's goal in life and purpose in life was to hunt these people. And so he was interested in them in that he wanted to kill them. But I don't think God thinks that he was romantic about them.
Yeah.
Turns out he was. Want to walk us through the soup incident, though? The soup incident?
The soup incident is pretty epic. And when you're first reading this, you're like, why am I spending so much time reading about Harrow making soup?
Yeah, a full 2 pages.
It's a lot. And actually, there are parts of it that are really clever. And if you are someone who gets nerdy about necromancy and how the magic system works,
mm-hmm.
It's actually pretty fun to go back and read Harrow making soup because there are necromantic reasons why, for example, she adds a lot of water at the very end. There are reasons why she picked vegetables that Gideon the First didn't like so that he would just eat the water. And so again, if you go back and read this, and I won't go into all the details of how Harrow made this soup, but it can be fun for the nerds in the house.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so Harrow makes soup. It takes her a really long time. It's a really funny description. Ianthe had told her just to burn an onion, add some water and salt and meat, and you'll be good to go with your soup.
Mm-hmm.
And Harrow doesn't add salt, but she does. There's a little bit in here where it says that she also locked herself in the bathroom to do what you had to do.
Mm-hmm.
No idea what that means when we're first reading this, but essentially what we learn is that Harrow has sectioned part of her tibia to get her own marrow from the bone to cook in the soup. That is how fucking hardcore and badass Harrow is.
I'm telling you, Harrow's the best.
And so they all sit down to eat, and it doesn't taste really good. I think there's a funny bit in here where God coughs after he takes his first bite.
Mm-hmm.
Augustine's like, oh, this is bad, but at least it's different. So let me give you all these recipes that I like so you can mess them up. These lictors are so dead inside that any little change to their 10,000-year life is mildly interesting. There's a discussion about Cassiopeia's cooking and how Cassiopeia was a really good cook, but that one time she cut off her finger and didn't tell anyone. And so they had basically eaten part of Cassiopeia.
Uh-huh.
And when they're talking about this, they're jokingly, Harrow Hark, you have to confess the first thing so that we don't do that. And Harrow flinches, but they ask her what the meat is. And then there's this build up paragraph where Harrow's doing all these things at once. she's concentrating. And you're like, wait, what are you concentrating for? You're just eating soup. And then she responds, marrow. And shit hits the fan.
Literally.
Basically, a construct explodes out of the Saint of Duty. And the construct is literally formed inside his body because of the marrow. So Harrow's pulling the marrow together and then makes this construct. And rips apart the Saint of Duty's body. And then God says, stop.
Yep. And this is, I think, one of 2 times that God does this in these books so far. And I don't really understand what exactly it is, but it's some sort of spell where God basically stops time. And I don't know how it fits into necromancy or whatever sort of weird thalurgy magic he has as well. But I assume it's also how he like keeps all the vegetables and food fresh in their storage and keeps the thanergy from leaking out of all the bones in the Mithraeum. But he freezes everyone except for himself and Harrow. So in this room, everything is stopped.
Well, their bodies are stopped. And Harrow's body's frozen. She can't move, but she can talk.
Right. So everyone else is kind of like, I don't know what they're experiencing, but they can't move at all or speak or do anything.
Right.
And God's kind of like, okay, what's going on here? He says, 10,000 years since I've eaten human being. I didn't really want to do it again or something like that.
Yeah, what is that about?
I thought it was because maybe shit got so bad on Earth before the resurrection that they had to like practice cannibalism to survive. But then I was like, maybe it's because when you do the eightfold word, you have to ingest part of your cavalier. So he could be referring to Electo.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's right.
But I don't know. Anyway, he's like, you must know I won't let either of you kill the other before my very eyes, which is so so unfair.
It kind of reminds me of when we were at Canaan House in Gideon the Ninth, and it's like the riddle at the beginning where a teacher was like, you can't enter a locked door without permission. It's like reading between the lines there. And here, God is not saying that he isn't going to allow either of them to kill each other. It just can't be in front of him for some reason.
Right. And he asks her how long she's been awake, and she says 6 days. And he's like, that's enough. And he does that kind of flash heal of Gideon the First, and everyone springs back to life, and all this gore splatters all over the table. And God tells Ianthe to take Harrow to her room to sleep, and tells everyone else to leave as well, except for Mithraeum.
Yeah. This was interesting. He essentially blames Mithraeum for not understanding how powerful Harrow is.
Implying that he had asked Mithraeum to check Harrow out and see how powerful she was, which is interesting.
I think there's another point in this book where I can't remember where it is, where it's something similar that like Mercy wasn't paying attention enough to Harrow. But in any case, Mithraeum is like so powerful, especially with the body and everything. And God's like, you're not doing your job. Harrow's your person, you know? Augustine got Ianthe and you got Harrow. And he's just surprised by her, it seems, continually.
Yeah. And he really likes Harrow for whatever reason. And so I think he is pretty blown away by what she just did. Mithraeum, on the other hand, says, but this is insane. She's only 9 years old.
I'm going to try and do this in preparation for our next episode. I wonder if there's a math pattern to each time Mercy says she's only X years old, if it's...
Find the code.
I'm so stuck on like, is this just funny? Or what?
I think it's just funny. My theory is that it's just Tamsyn Muir having a laugh.
So at the end of this chapter, everyone kind of goes away. God asks Ianthe to kind of take Harrow away and take care of her. Augustine and Gideon the First walk out together. And as Ianthe and Harrow are leaving, Harrow looks at Augustine and the Saint of Duty, and what's written here is that Augustine looks like he has just seen the ghost of someone he did not particularly like. And then also the Saint of Duty kind of nods, gives Harrow a head nod as she's leaving. Kind of like a sign of respect in some ways. I have a theory that Pyrrha has arrived in this moment, and that the head nod being given to Harrow is actually coming from Pyrrha, not Gideon the First. But that is just a little pet theory that I have.
Interesting. And I think that that's the end of this chapter. You really go out with a bang.
Yeah, it's a whole mess. Everything is...
Yep.
It's wild. It is wild.
Yep. We're starting to get into some of my favorite bits of the book, so I'm really excited. Next time, I think we're going to cover quite a big chunk.
So stay tuned, y'all.
Yeah. So thank you as always for joining us. If you liked listening, please rate and review us. And if you have any questions or comments or want to point out something that we missed, send us a question on our website, locktoompod.com, or on Twitter at locktoompod. We release episodes on Tuesdays wherever you find podcasts. Thanks as always to Olivia Kay for our theme music. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
And we'll see you next time here at the Locked Tomb Podcast.